Today's daf we're going to be learning is Ketubot, daf Kuf Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Jessica Shklar in honor of her sister, Hadron stalwart Ruth Leah Kahan, in appreciation for hosting my boys and their miscellaneous friends who've been visiting Israel over the last few months. Thank you for giving them a home. Okay, we're going to get started with, or continue with, the fascinating story of the death of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Before I start, I can't help but mention the obvious comparison between the Torah reading yesterday of Moshe's death and the death of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And you just really feel, I was in shul listening to the laning and thinking about, it's the most dramatic of Torah readings. And really the story is of the most dramatic stories of the death of an important, prominent rabbi. And you really feel, when you see it and you read in shul so dramatically the death of Moshe and the eulogizing of the people for 30 days. And then exactly, we had in our daf this eulogizing of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, comparing it to the way they eulogize Moshe. And the way, also we read about the Yehoshua taking over. And here also, he's making sure that everything's in place for when he leaves and who's taking over. And you really feel this is a very big turning point. And that's going to be also the background for the story we're going to see today. So the story, the Gemara starts off, okay, what we saw in yesterday's daf was all the preparation for his death, okay, where he told them, this is what I want you to do, and this is what I want to happen, and this is going to take over, and he's kind of preparing them for what they need to do. Then we have Hahu Yomi. We're now at the day of Rebbi's death. Denach nafshei de Rebbi, so the day that Rebbi died. Gazru Rabbanan ta'anita. The rabbi saw he was nearing death. They start praying. That's what people do, right? See someone's very sick, you pray for their good health. So they made a fast. They start praying for mercy. Amre, and they make the following statement, which is kind of a very interesting statement. Kol man da amar nach nafshei de Rebbi yidakel becherev. Anyone who says that Rebbi died will be stabbed by the sword. It's a very strange thing to say because someone's going to have to announce Rebbi's death. And why can't you tell people that Rebbi died? And I guess, they want it to be, we'll see later, maybe. They want it to be done properly, prepare the people for the fact that even though you can imagine they must have been preparing for his death, but it's never, right? It's never the same when it actually happens. And they don't want people announcing it, maybe because they're worried that when they announce it, people will faint, people will, get so upset. And therefore, or maybe they're worried that somebody might say it before he's actually dead. And then what will happen? Everyone will stop praying and then he'll actually die. So, this is like, they don't want rumors to get spread, right? So don't do it, because if you start spreading a rumor, you'll get stabbed. Okay, why stab by a sword? I don't know. It's interesting. Now in comes the maidservant of Rebbi. We're going to see very clearly nobody else is with Rebbi except for his maidservant, which is very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, this great man, and when he dies, he's left with this one maidservant. Now, if you remember, she was a very smart woman. Okay, we're going to start our Gemara with a smart woman. We're going to end today our chapter with a very smart woman and assertive women. Okay, very interesting daf today. Maybe interesting way to end Masechet Ketubot with stories of assertive women that we're not yet at the end, but I have to say the next chapter, which is going to start tomorrow, starts at the end of today's daf, but we'll start it tomorrow, is already like a bit of a different unit of things. So we're really kind of near the end of the Masechet. And we have this maidservant who, if you remember, she has witty comments to the rabbis, and she always knows the translations of words that they don't know. So anyway, Slika amte de Rebbi leigla. She goes up to the roof. Amra, she says, and this is why you can imagine she goes to the roof. El yonim mevakshim et Rebbi. People up above want Rebbi. It's clear, right? He's ready to die. The angels want to bring him up to heaven. But the people down below, that's why she's kind of in the attic. She's in between the heavens and the earth. She says the people down below want Rebbi. Here comes her prayer. Right? Let the lower ones win out. Basically also praying for his survival. But but then she sees how many times he's going to the bathroom. Okay, he was sick, he had stomach problems. And she sees how many times he's going to the bathroom. And every time he has to take off his tefillin and go into the bathroom and put them back on. And it's too much for him. He's suffering. I'm not suffering. Tosfot asks, why is he putting on tefillin? Cholei me'ayim aren't supposed to put on tefillin because it'll be a bushad of the tefillin because, they might actually have an accident or something. So Tosfot says, obviously, Rebbi was more capable than the average person and knew how to do it properly. Anyway, that's a side question. So when she sees that, and this is a huge source used for all sorts of questions of, when it gets to, someone's suffering a lot, what are you allowed to do to end their life? So Amra, she actually starts praying for his death. Okay, that's the first thing you see she does. What's the problem? She's one maidservant. She's a maidservant. And all the rabbis just won't stop praying for mercy. Okay, so you see here, the people are disconnected with what's going on. She's got her finger on the pulse of what's happening, literally. And she sees he's suffering and says, you know what? It's time to end his life. So what does she do? She doesn't just sit around. She's an assertive woman, as we're going to see this woman at the end of our daf also. Shakla kuza, she grabs a jug. Shadya me'igra la'ara, she throws it from the roof to the ground. You know what's going to happen. It's going to make a big smashing sound. I broke something last night also. It was pretty late at night and broke glass, and everybody in my house was like, whoa, everybody stops when that happens. Ishtukume rachame. They stopped praying for a minute, for a second, because they stopped what happened. And nach nafshe de Rebbi. Exactly as they stopped praying, Rebbi dies at that exact moment. Amrule Rabbanan lebar kapara. So now, she basically succeeds in getting done what needs to get done, and he dies, which we assume is a good thing. Sounds like it from the story. Amrule Rabbanan lebar kapara. In the meantime, the rabbis say to bar kapara, Zil ayin, you should go into Rebbi and see maybe he's not alive anymore. Azal eshkechei denach nafshe. He goes in, he sees that Rebbi is in fact no longer alive. Kare lilavushe, he tears his garment. That's what you do when your rabbi dies, you tear your garment. Va'ahadre lekare la'achore. But what does he do? He switches his cloak around, puts the tear on the back. Why? Two possible reasons. Number one, he wants to break it to the people easily, calmly, like not that they'll see him walk out with the tear and they'll all go crazy. And remember, it says anyone who heralds and says that Rebbi's dead, it's basically by walking out with your torn garment. You're basically saying Rebbi's dead, and he doesn't want to announce it because he doesn't want to get stabbed, or also, I don't think he really thought he was going to get stabbed, but, he basically didn't want to be the one to go against what they said. So he comes out with his garment flipped so that no one will know. Patach va'amal. He starts to say the following statement. Arelim u'mitzukim achazu ba'aron HaKodesh. The people above, angels, and the mitzukim, which are the great ones, which are the tzaddikim, are pulling on the Aron Kodesh, right? The malachim want him up above. This is similar to what she said. And the great ones on this earth want him down below. He calls him the Aron HaKodesh. He's basically saying it in code words. Nitzchu arelim et hamitzukim v'nishba Aron HaKodesh. Okay, the angels have won, have beaten out the tzaddikim, and it's been taken into captivity, the Aron HaKodesh. Okay, very beautiful way to say that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is no longer with us. And he tries to break it to them slowly, right? By the way, in certain communities in Israel, in Haredi communities, when a gadol dies, they use this phrase, nitzchu arelim et hamitzukim, and they announce it in the streets. They have these announcements going, and these are the words that they use. Comes from our Gemara. Amrulei nach nafshe. So all the people then said, Rebbi must have died. Amar lehu, to which he says to them, kind of a childish line, Atum kamaritu ani lo kamina. You're the ones who said it. I didn't say it, right? Basically trying to absolve himself from responsibility of having been the one to herald his death. B'sha'at ptirato shel Rebbi. Now, moving scenes. Okay, we were in his deathbed and all the things Rebbi said. Then, right, that was yesterday's daf. Then we got into what actually happened at the moment of his death. How did he actually die? And now we have before he died, going back a little bit, what was the last thing that Rebbi did? So Zakaf Eser Etzba'otav Klapei Mali, picks up his 10 fingers, holds them up toward above. Amar Ribbono shel Olam, says, God, Galoi v'yadu al panecha, you know, sheyagati be'eser etzba'otai b'Torah. I used all my 10 fingers to learn Torah. I did hard work with my fingers, interesting. Fingers aren't the ones you really think of learning Torah. Maybe looking at the spot in the book. I don't know. Interesting, he says it, but he's trying to say with all my body. Which is maybe why he wants to use his fingers. I didn't even benefit one finger from. Now, what does this mean? Either I didn't benefit enough from my students, right? I don't feel, which Rabbi Elazar ben Horkinu says on his death, on the same kind of idea. Or maybe he means I didn't benefit in this world at all, like I didn't enjoy things. All I did was learn Torah. There's a bunch of different ways to explain this. He prays that there be peace in his death. What he might be saying is peace for his soul. What he might be saying is peace for the people, right? We generally know that the death of a tzaddik atones for the other people. So maybe that's what he's asking for. Yatzta bat kol v'amra, a heavenly voice comes down and says, Yavo shalom, you will come in peace. Yanuchu al mishkavotam, and you will rest on their resting places. So now the Gemara says something's weird about that line. Now, this is, by the way, a pasuk from Yeshayahu, which we're going to darshan in a minute in another drasha, similar, but Yavo Shalom is the pasuk. Peace will come. Yanuchu al mishkavotam, they will rest in peace, right? This is, we always say they will rest in peace. By the way, this is in Yizkor. This phrase comes up in some of the Yizkor prayers. Yanuchu al mishkavotam, that's what we say. Al mishkavotam. Holech nichucho, okay, which means, and they will walk straight. We'll have to see what that is in a minute. Anyway, he should have said, the bat kol should have said, Al mishkavcha mebayale. Okay, the truth is they even say the pasuk should. Because the pasuk is saying, Yavo Shalom, which is singular, and then it switches to, the truth is it should have been asked also on Yanuchu. It should be Yanuach al mishkavcha, and not, or al mishkavo. A bunch of questions about this, why they say specifically mishkavcha, why they don't say on the Yanuchu is a problem. Why don't they say Yanuchu al mishkavo and al mishkavcha? Either way, they're basically asking about the language here. Misayer, so the fact that it says mishkavotam in plural must be referring to what Rabbi Chia bar Gamda said. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Gamda, Amar Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul, the son of Yossi ben Shaul. B'sha'ah tzaddik niftar min ha'olam, when a tzaddik leaves this world, omrim malachei hasharet lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the angels say to God, Ribbono shel olam tzaddik ploni ba. He started announcing there's a tzaddik who's on his way. Omer lahem, he says to them, Yavo tzaddikim v'yetzu l'kato. Tzaddikim should go out and greet him. And they say, Yavo b'shalom. Notice they change it to b'shalom. This matches the whole thing at the end of brachot. When you say to someone who's alive, you say lech l'shalom. When you say to someone who dies, you say lech b'shalom. So Yavo b'shalom, Yanuchu al mishkavotam. Okay, and who's Yanuchu al mishkavotam? All the tzaddikim that went out, right? They will then rest after that. That's why it's plural, because a tzaddik doesn't go by himself. Basically escorted by all these other people, all the other tzaddikim in the heavens. Now that we quoted this pasuk, we're going to quote a midrash on it. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Misha'ah tzaddik niftar min ha'olam, same thing. When a tzaddik dies, shalosh kitot shemalachei hasharet yotzot l'kato. 3 groups of angels go to greet him. Achat omeret lo bo b'shalom. One group says, come in peace. Echat omeret holech nichacho, walk in a straight path. Echat omeret lo yavo shalom yanuchu al mishkavotam. And the third one says, peace should come and you will rest in peace. But this is where we get this, that we always say rest in peace. So now there's a really fascinating Maharal on this, where he says, in order to create a relationship with God, 3 things have to happen. A very interesting and deep thought, which is, and it relates not only to our relationship with God, our relationship with other people as well. Which is number 1, Bo b'shalom means you need to be interested in going to God, right? You need to be interested in that relationship. So there has to be interest on the part of the person. Holech nichecho, you also have to go in a straight path and go in God's ways. And then there also has to be interest on God's part to have the relationship, right? You could want to have a relationship with someone and they're wholly uninterested and you're not going to get anywhere. So that's the bo b'shalom, when he says at the end, when the third group says to them, right, Yavo Shalom, Yanuchu al mishkavotam, that's God saying, I'm going to bring you to me. So there has to be those 3 elements in order to have, right, for any relationship, and all the more so a relationship with God, something to think about. And then the reverse of that is, when a bad person, or however you define Rasha, An evil person leaves this world. Instead of angels, now we have angels of, that come to injure, right? Bad angels, so to speak. There is no shalom, God says to the Rishaim. It's a pasuk. Which again, they're not interested in a relationship with me. You will sleep, you will lie down unhappily, okay? And you will place yourself with the arelim. Okay, in other words, I'm not interested in accepting you. So that's the end of this tragic story of the death of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi and how difficult, again, you think about, it must have been a huge, like we talked about Moshe and what a hard transition that was for the people. This also must have been a huge transition for the people and a huge loss for them, which is why it's described in such a dramatic manner. And like I said, we learn a bunch of things about this. Number one, the last thing we just learned about relationship with God. And we learn about issues with people who are suffering, right? What we can do, right? All these questions. Can you pull out the plug? They're on a machine, right? Here, at least they give you flexibility within prayer. Number one, to stop praying. Number two, right, to cause others to stop praying. And also even to pray for negative, right? To pray for their death is allowed. Obviously, there's many other questions about what else can be done. I'm going to leave that for another time. That's not in our sugya. Okay, and again, the wisdom of the Amma who understood, whose finger was on the pulse of what was happening and understood what needed to be done. New Mishna. Now we're going to talk about, is there an end day where a woman can no longer get her ketuba? Does she give up her rights at a certain point for possible reasons? We're going to see a machloket in the Mishna. So normally, if a woman's husband dies, again, this is different from a divorcee. If a woman's husband dies and she can get food payments if she stays in his house. If she goes back to her father's house, she generally, and I say generally because we're going to see an exception later, she generally doesn't get food from them. And then generally she'll get her ketuba money because, again, there's monthly food payments, which is better to be getting that than your one lump sum of the ketuba, unless you're desperate for a big sum of money. And right, once you get your ketuba, you don't get mezonot anymore. So usually she would push that off. But if he's not giving her mezonot, then probably she'd go demand her ketuba. If she's living in the husband's house, her deceased husband, then she continues generally to get food payments. And then at the end, whatever the end is, right, at some point, she can demand her ketuba and then she'll stop getting food payments, right? If she goes to get married, then obviously she gets her ketuba and moves on. But if she doesn't get married again, she could theoretically, and that's going to be the question, is there an end date there at all? So kozman she bebeit avia, we're going to distinguish between if she's in her father's house and not getting food, and in her deceased husband's house and getting food. If she's in her father's house, go back to batal olam. She can continue. If she doesn't ever demand her ketuba, she can demand it 30 years later, 40 years later, it doesn't matter. Kozman she bebeit baala, she's in her husband's house, go back to batal 25 shani. But if she's in her husband's house, she only has 25 years. Why is this? This is Rabbi Meir. The rabbi is going to totally disagree. Rabbi Meir says, when she's living in her husband's house, what happens? Now, the way Rashi explains this, Yerushalmi explains it a little differently, but we'll go with Rashi, because most of the commentaries agree with him, that basically, when you're living in someone's house, neighbors come, they need some food, she gives them food, right? Now, her own mezonot, she's deserving of, but the extra that she's giving to her friend are really their stuff. So in 25 years, the little bit of sugar, the little bit of flour, the eggs that she gives to her neighbors accumulates and basically adds up to the amount of a ketuba. So Rabbi Meir says at 25 years, she's done basically. She can't start getting her ketuba money because her ketuba money has been spent, not meaning to be spent, but has been spent in favors all these years. I have some questions on him. So if you're thinking of questions, we'll get there. Chachamim omrim the opposite. Kozman she bebeit baala, go back to batal olam. As long as she's in her husband's house and getting food, she can always demand her ketuba. But kozman she bebeit avia, go back to batal 25 shanim. Why is that? That's because if she's in her father's house and she's not getting mezonot payments, why didn't she demand the ketuba? If 25 years passes, well, she must have already given up on getting it and said, I don't really care. I don't really need the ketuba money. Now, all of a sudden, after 25 years, she turns around and says, well, I'm going to get my ketuba. Right? There's a little bit of what we call, I'm trying to think of the word in Hebrew, it's hityashnu. Like at a certain point, you just can't go and take a credit slip from 15 years ago and try to use it in the store. They're going to say, what were you doing all those 15 years? Why didn't you use it? So at a certain point, it expires. So he says, if you're living in your father's house and they're not feeding you food, then you should have demanded your ketuba. And the fact that you didn't must be you gave up on it. You're not interested in it. But if you were living in your husband's house and they were feeding you food payments all along, first of all, you were getting food payments. You didn't want to demand your ketuba. And secondly, if you were thinking of you wanted to collect your ketuba, you were embarrassed to. Because if they give you a monthly stipend every month, all of a sudden you're going to ask them for a big amount of money. They're doing so many nice things for you all the time that you're embarrassed to start asking for the ketuba. So if they're not giving you anything, there's no embarrassment there. Okay, we're going to see this later in the Gemara in the story at the end of the daf, that we're going to see that she's basically going to say, or the Gemara is going to say that it's because of embarrassment. She wasn't going to ask because it's embarrassing. They're helping you every day, right? Often when people are doing nice things to you, you don't want to ask for more. They'll stop doing what they're doing, or it just might be embarrassing and difficult for you to ask. So thank you for helping. The statute of limitations. Okay, that's what the words I was struggling for. So now, Meta, what if she dies? And now we're talking about her Yorshim. Did they have a statute of limitations? Yorshim mazkirin ketubata 25 shanim. They have up to 25 years to mention ketuba, and right again after that they can't. Amar le Abaye le Rabbi Yosef. So the Gemara starts off with a few questions of Rabbi Meir. Number one, Aniyash b'Yisrael ad 25 shanim, u'marta b'baitus ad 25 shanim. Marta b'baitus was known to be a very wealthy woman, so they use her as their example of a wealthy woman. A poor person and a rich person have different sized ketubas. So if you're going to say they give their neighbors sugar and flour, and after 25 years, their ketuba is going to be at zero. What about a very wealthy woman who has a very big ketuba? What, it's also going to be at zero after 25 years? To which the Gemara answers a very good answer. Yeah, lepum gam l'shichna. According to the camel is the load. Marta b'baitus, when her neighbors come, she doesn't just give them sugar and flour. She gives them meat and other things that are very expensive. So yes, her ketuba will also, in a span of 25 years, she'll have given her ketuba in favors as well. But now they ask a much bigger question, which is the Rabbi Meir, if it's all about the money and that each year it basically gets reduced, so what about after 5 years? Do we reduce the ketuba by X amount? Do we have a formula that says, after 5 years, she's already done favors worth X. After 10 years, worth Y. After 15 years, right? Do we do that? So the answer is Keku, we don't really know. Okay, because it would be weird, according to Rabbi Meir, that all of a sudden, 25 years, we say, well, your ketuba is at zero. But if it's just before 25 years, she gets the full amount. That's a little bit strange. Chachamim omrim, kolzman. So now we go move to Chachamim. Amar le Abaye le Rabbi Yosef. He asks also a similar question. I don't get it. We're now at the eve of the 25th year. Now, according to halacha, if she, and this, by the way, can be asked about many, many halachot, if she demands the ketuba right before the sunset, then she gets her ketuba. And la'achar shkiat chama lo gavya, but then a minute later, once the sun sets, she can't get it anymore. Are we saying, Ba'u porta achilta? It was that exact moment she says, oh yeah, I'm not planning to get my ketuba anymore. And then she demands it a minute later. That sounds a little strange. To which she says, yes, in fact, it is that way. Why? Because kol midat chachamim kenu. The rabbis established requisite amounts, and that's just the way it is. Barba'in se'at tovel. We've seen this many times, right? 40 se'at is the amount of a mikvah. Barba'in chaser kortuf eno yachol litbol b'hem. But if it's missing a drop, a little bit, less than 40 se'at, it's not a kosher mikvah. You go in it, it's not like you did a tefillah. So basically, and this is a theme we talked about before, about the makoch beitin yafeh, right? That the rabbis have a certain power, and we give them that power to do that. That yes, even though sometimes it's a little arbitrary, but you have to draw the line somewhere. And yes, the line is drawn at exactly 25 years. If it's before Shkia, she can get her to, but if it's after Shkia, she can't. Amar Rav Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi B'fnei Rebbi Shamar Mishum Aviv. We're now going to have a machlok at Rav and Rabbi Elazar about the rabbi's position. So Rav says, okay, this is passed down in the name of Rav, who passes down in the name of Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi. Lo shanu ela she'ein shtar ketuba yotze mitachat yadeh. This is only if she doesn't have a document of the ketuba in hand. Aval shtar ketuba yotze mitachat yadeh gova ketubata le'olam. If she has the ketuba still, she can collect it. Because the assumption is, if she decided to just say, forego the ketuba and say, I don't really care anymore, she would have returned it to them. So the fact that she still has it in hand must be an indicator that she didn't. And then she could still collect her ketuba. Rabbi Elazar disagrees and says, even if she has the ketuba, she still only has 25 years. Safrai talks about in his book, Mishna, that the 25 years is really like a generation thing. And people forget things, right? Like already at 25 years, you can imagine that he adds other things that aren't in the sugya, but that there could be this concern that people don't remember anymore. Maybe she collected it, maybe she didn't, right? That there's all this concern of forgetting. The same people aren't alive anymore. It's a generation. Like, where do we get 25 from? He says it must be, that's generally we say, right? 20, 25 is a generation thing. Although in the Tosefta, there's an opinion that it's 30 years also. Okay, so anyway, we have this machloket whether she has a ketuba or she doesn't have a ketuba. So Rav says it's only talking about a case where she doesn't have a ketuba in hand. In which case, we're going to now see a bunch of two questions against Rav from the following sources. Mativ Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet brings the following source as a contradiction. Baal chov govesh shelo b'hazkara. A Baal chov can collect even if he never mentioned it for all 25 years. He can still collect his loan. Okay, if you're a creditor, you can collect it. There's no statute of limitation. Hey, chidami, what's the case? Doesn't have a star in hand. Of course he can't collect. Well, on what basis is he collecting? Like, the assumption is if he doesn't have it, he must have given it back because he actually got paid back. Ella dinakit shtara. But it must be he was with a star in hand. Now, what is this telling you? A Baal chov can. There's no statute of limitations for a creditor. That's trying to distinguish him from our widow. Baal chov hu delav bar chulehu. We assume a Baal chov will never, we never forego his loan, but he has to have a star. And yet it's saying ha'almana achilta. But a widow, we assume, might forego her ketuba. And therefore, it must be in the same situation when she has a star in hand. So that goes against Rav, who said if she has a star in hand, she can even collect it after 25 years. So Rav Sheshet brought this question, who motivla, but who mefarik? He answers it. Lo'olam de lo nakit star. It's really a case where he didn't have a star in hand. Why does he get to collect it? Hacha b'mayaskinan. What's the case? Keshachayav mode. It's when the love, the borrower, agrees with him and says, I agree that I owe you money. Then you can collect it even without a document. Bahama Rabbi Elazar, second question against Rav, very similar type thing. Shonim, we learn in a braita, grusha harei kebal chov. A divorcee is like a Baal chov in this area. There's no statute of limitations. Hey chidami, what's the case? Idelo nikita ketuba ma'agavia. Again, if she doesn't have a ketuba in hand, on what basis is she collecting? Ela lav denaki ketuba. It must be she has a ketuba, and then ugrusha hu delav bar chulehu. It means a divorcee. We assume she's not foregoing because why would she want to forego? She didn't have a good relationship with her husband to begin with. Ha'almana, but if she's a widow, maybe she would be a chilte, right? And a chilte in what case? And she has a star. To which again the Gemara says, no, achanami b'shchayav mode. It must be when the husband agrees that he never gave her the ketuba. And then she doesn't have to have a star in hand, and neither of these are questions. Now we're going to bring a braita to support Rav. I'm Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Tani, Rabbi Yehuda bar Kaza, B'manita de bar Kaza. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Kaza, brought a braita from the house, from the Beit Midrash of Beit Kaza, of Bar Kaza. Tav'ak ketubata, moving out Amud Bet. If she demands her ketuba, harei kebetchila. This line isn't important for our purposes, but it's the beginning of the braita. If a woman demands a ketuba but didn't get it yet, then we start the count of 25 all over again, okay? Because it's clear she wasn't muchelet. Starts from the beginning. V'im haya shtar ketubata. This is the important part. If the shtar ketuba was yotzei mitachat yadeh, if she had the star in hand, gova ketubata la'olam, then she can collect it forever. That's Rav. Here we're going to have people who are questioning the same question. Shalach le Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda le Rav Nachman bar Yaakov Yilamdenu Rabbeinu. Please let me know. Kish shtar ketuba yotzei mitachat yadeh machloket. Is there machloket when she has a shtar ketuba in her hand, when she doesn't. And do we hold like Rabbi Meir? Do we hold like the rabbis? Shalach le, Rav Nachman bar Yaakov sends back to Rav Nachman bar Chisda. B'she'ein shtar ketuba yotzei mitach yadam machloket. The machloket is when there's no ketuba in hand, meaning he holds like Rav. She has a ketuba, she can collect it. Aval shtar ketuba yotzei mitach yadam gova ketuba talon. Everyone agrees, according to him, that if she has the ketuba in hand, she can collect. So he holds like Rav against Rabbi Elazar. And we hold like the rabbis, again, which say if she's in her father's house, then we assume there's mechila. So if she doesn't have a ketuba in hand and she was in her father's house for 25 years, she gives up her rights to collect it. But if she was living with the husband in his house, not him, he wasn't alive anymore, for 25 years and they were feeding her, then she can still demand her ketuba forever. Ki'ata Rav Dimi, we're now going to have one other little machloket and then we'll get to our story. When Rav Dimi came, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Shimon Lev, Mishum Bar Kapari, brings the Torah of Israel. Lo shanu ela mana matayim, aval tosefet yesh la. This whole discussion about her collecting her ketuba is only the basic part of the ketuba, the 100 or the 200. Okay, but the tosefet, if he added extra, that's more like a gift, and that we don't assume that she foregoes ever. Rabbi Aval, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, but a different scholar from Israel, Rabbi Yehuda, was quoted as saying, "Afilu tosefet ein la." Even the tosefet she foregoes, which makes a lot of sense, which we're going to see in a minute. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yanai, T'nai ketuba ketuba dami. We've said this many times. All the conditions of the ketuba are like the ketuba. One of the conditions is the tosefet, the extra. It's going to be treated like the ketuba itself. Ketuba, she foregoes the extra as well. Itmar nami, and it was said also, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Lo shanu elamana matayim aval tosefet yeshla. Rav sides with the first opinion we saw, and Amarle. No, Rabbi. Notice who quoted. Rabbi Abba quoted Rabbi Huna as quoting Rav. So now Rabbi Abba himself says to Rav Huna, Amarle Rabbi Abba le Rav Huna, Amar Rav hachi. Okay, no, it's hard to say this top line because they're going to question how he says it. It makes a big difference how you say it. You could say, did Rav really say that? Or you could say, did Rav really say that? Okay, one is positive, one is negative, right? So when he said, did Rav really say that to Rav Huna didn't know what tone was he saying in it. Amarle, ishtikan kamart, are you trying to silence me? Oh, ashkiyan kamart. Or are you trying to drink me wine? Basically, like raise a toast to me because, wow, amazing that Rav said that. So Amarle, ishtikan kamina. What I meant to do was to silence you, which is fascinating in and of itself. First of all, there's two interesting things here, and then I'm going to move on because we really don't have time. But one is that this contradicts something Rav said previously, which explains why Rabbi Abba was against it. Okay, you can look in the footnotes. If you have footnotes there, they explain it, but I'm not going to get into it right now. But that's number one, something that Rav said earlier. And number two, it's interesting because Rabbi Abba was quoted as having quoted Rav Huna, who said in the name of Rav, and then he himself was trying to silence him. Why then did he pass on this tradition? Is a good question. Okay, so anyway, he said, I think it's crazy that you're saying that Rav said this. Now we get to our story. It's a bit complicated. That's why I wanted to save enough time to get through it. The mother-in-law of Rav Chia bar Aricha was also married to his brother. A little bit strange, but okay. That's really not so important, but it was his mother-in-law married to the brother. Okay, he had two relations with her, which maybe explains why the beginning of the story happens. Now his brother dies and leaves her a widow. He now supports her for the next 25 years in her father's house, meaning she went back. This is the opposite of our Mishna. Normally we say if she goes back to her father's house, you don't give her food. But he very nicely decided to give her food for 25 years. So he's giving her food every day for 25 years. And even though she's not even living in their household, and you have to remember, he also inherited the brother, okay, right? Because he was his brother, he got his stuff. Now, what happens? L'sof, at 25 years, Amrle Havli Mizone. She says, she comes on the morning of the 25th day and says, can you give me food? Amrla, Leilach Mizone. You don't have food anymore. It's 25 years. I don't have to give you food anymore. Havli Ketuba. Give me my ketuba then if you're not going to give me Mizono. Amrla, Lo Mizone Ilach, Velo Ketuba Ilach. You don't get Mizono or ketuba. Now, why is that? Because ketuba, because we already said she foregoes her ketuba if she's living in her father's house. Mizonot, what do we say? Well, Mezonot are also a t'nai ketuba. We haven't discussed this yet today, but it's also a condition, a stipulation in the ketuba that he'll feed her, right? That the orphans and the family, right? In this case, it's his brother, will feed her. Now, that, since the ketuba runs out after 25 years, claimed Rabbi Aricha, so does your mezonot. Now, in fact, it's not so true. And this is what's going to happen. This woman was smart. She says, Tivate Ladina, she takes him to court. She says, I know what you're talking about. You owe me the money. Takes him to court. Kamei de Rabbi Bar Shila. She goes in front of Rabbi Bar Shila. Armalei, he says to, now, Rabbi Bar Shila turns to Rabbi Aricha and says to him, Emily, easy, gufa du'uf. Tell me exactly what transpired. I've seen this. We just had this in another case, that wording. Amarle, Zanita 25 shanim bebei Nasha. I supported her for 25 years in her father's house. Now remember, what do Chachamim say? If you support her in the husband's house, then after 25 years, you have to keep feeding her. But if she's in her father's house, she forgoes her ketuba. She didn't demand it. But, right, and he said, B'chayei demal, and I swear in your name, on the life of Rabbi Bar Shila, Dibikatve amtela. I carried her food every day on my shoulders. In other words, I did so much good for this woman, and now she's claiming I owe her more money. Amarle. So he says to him, Rabbi Bar Shila says, Tamamai amar Rabbanit kozman shi bebeit ba'ala govak tubata lo'olam. What's the reason that they say that if she's living in her husband's house, she could demand her ketuba forever? Dambrina, and here's what I told you in the Mishna that we'd see later, mishum kisufahu delo tava. She was embarrassed to ask for her ketuba. The fact that she didn't demand her ketuba was because she was embarrassed to, because he was doing nice things for her every day, giving her food. It was embarrassing for her to start demanding more money. So even though she wasn't living in your house, but hachanami mishum kisufahu delo tava, you brought her food every day, probably every week, every month, whatever it was, but you brought her food. And therefore, she was embarrassed to ask you for the ketuba. So her silence is not translated as, I forego my ketuba. And therefore, zil hava, you have to give her a ketuba. Nothing to do about it. Okay, the story could have ended there. But it gets a little more complicated, because Rabbi Aricha was a difficult guy. Lo eshkach, he decided not to listen to what Rabbi Bar Shila did. So, katav la adrachta anichse. So Rabbi Bar Shila writes this woman in adrachta. In adrachta is a document, an adrachta on his nechasim, on his property. It's a document that says, you can seize any of his property because you're owed money by this guy. So she gets an adrachta. Now, what happens when you get an adrachta? It's going to be important more for the end of the story. The rabbis evaluate what it's worth. They announce for 30 days. Remember, we talked about that. They announce for 30 days in order to get the best price. And then they sell the property. So some time transpires between the time they write the adrachta till she's actually going to get the money. In the meantime, he wasn't satisfied with this. He goes before Rava, figures, okay, this Dayan didn't rule like me. Maybe I'll find Rava who will rule like me. Amarle, so Rava says to him, Chazemar hechidanan. Aricha says to him, Chazemar hechidanan. Look, Rava, look at how they judged me in court, this Rabbi Bar Shila. Amarle, Shapir danach. He says, sounds to me like he did the right thing. Sorry, but you're wrong. So now the woman sees that the second rabbi ruled in her favor, and she says, oh, well, then I'm going to try to get some more out of this. And more, that's what we would say, magiali, she's deserving of. She was a very smart woman, and she clearly knew halacha, as we're going to see here. Although in the end, unfortunately, maybe I should not give it away, but she doesn't end up fully winning. Okay, she is going to get her ketuba, don't worry. They're not going to take that away from her. But she says, listen, if he's really wrong, and he really should have given me the money right away, then Amrele, Ihachi, if that's the case, I want all the proceeds from that field from the day they wrote the adrachta until now. In other words, this thing has been going on in the courts for a while. I've been taking a loss because that land would have been in my property. I would have had fruits. I would have sold them. That's a loss for me. I want to get all the proceeds from that land from that day. Amarla, so Rabbi says, okay, so show me your adrachta. I'll check the date, I'll see, and we can try to do that. Chazye, but when he looks at the adrachta, he realizes there's a mistake in the adrachta. Delo have a ktivba, v'ishtamodana dinechasim elu dimitana inun. There's something that's supposed to be in an adrachta like this. It's supposed to say, we, the judges, know, we're pointing out that the land that she can demand, the land she's trying to get to, is not the land of Rabbi Chia Aricha. It's the land of her deceased husband. Rabbi Chia Aricha has a bunch of fields. Some are his deceased brothers that he inherited. Now, she only has a lien. This is all her ketuba money, which was lien to the brother's property, the deceased brother. So basically, when they said she can seize his property, they didn't mean she can seize all his property. She can only seize the property of the dead brother that was inherited by Rav Chia Aricha. But they didn't write that in the drachta. So he says, sorry, but the drachta has a mistake in it. And therefore, I can't give you the proceeds from when it was written. So she says, Amarle, tezela drachta, fine, so forget that. But ishkam yom tashlime yom achaz tad hashta. At least, this whole thing has been delayed by a bunch of things. Number one, okay, so from the day of the drachta, I get. But then after the drachta, they evaluated the property. They announced for 30 days. And we haven't sold it yet because we're arguing about it. So because of that, I at least deserve the money from the day that we finished the announcing and we theoretically could have sold, and he's been delaying me. To which he says to her, no can do. Because he says, that's only if there's no mistake in the adrachta. But since this whole adrachta was messed up in the beginning, none of this is relevant. The days of Achbarazah aren't relevant. You can't get your payroll. Again, she'll still get her ketuba. Don't forget, this woman is not ending up with nothing. But she can't say that the delay has caused me a loss and I want you to pay me back for it. All because of this mistake. So Amrale, this woman's very assertive, right? If we talk about the women who are embarrassed and don't want to start asking for money and this and that, this woman is clearly, right, not embarrassed. She knows her stuff. She's coming up with arguments. And here she has a good one. This is her strongest. She says, wait a minute, you're Rava. Now, Hamar, Huda Amar, aren't you the one who says, she clearly knew her stuff, aren't you the one who says, Achrayut ta'ut sofer? Who? Now, what does this mean? We've learned this a bunch of times. When I sell you land, if it has a lien on it, they can demand it from you. But you can go back to me and say, right, you're responsible, give me back the money that I lost by buying this land from you, and now your creditor took it away. However, that's only if I sold it to you with achrayut. But Rava says, even if I didn't sell it to you with achrayut, right? If I didn't specifically specify, I'm not selling this to you with a guarantee, but I didn't say anything, and it didn't say anything in the document, it's a ta'ut sofer. It means the sofer just forgot to write it. The scribe didn't put it in. But any sale is with achrayut, basically. So even if they didn't write it, it's obvious, and it's as if it's in there. So she says, it was obvious it was the dead brother's property. Even though they didn't say it, that's not a mistake. If you think that, now these aren't the same thing, but she's basically saying, if you're the one who says achrayut is ta'ut sofer, wouldn't you say that not writing it was the dead brother's property would also be a ta'ut sofer? And obviously the sofer meant it, just didn't write it, in which case I get it back from the date of the adrachta, right? So good claim, she says. Well, it doesn't work. Because Amar le Rava, ta'ut sofer. Achrayut, you could say it was a mistake. This you can't say was a mistake. How so? Because Rabbi Bar Shila really made a mistake in the beginning. He caused you to be stuck, really. What was his mistake? He looked at Rav Chia Aricha. He said, Rav Chia Aricha has property of his own. He has property inherited from his brother. This woman is supposed to get money from him. What's the difference? All of it is his at this point. It doesn't matter. She takes it from his property. It doesn't matter if she takes it from the brother's property. And that was his mistake. And therefore, it wasn't ta'ut sofer that they just forgot to write it in. They didn't write it in on purpose because Rabbi Bar Shila didn't realize that he needed to, right? He didn't realize that you can't actually take it from the brothers. Now, what's the big deal about this whole thing? So now we're going to see what Rava holds. The Lohi, it's not true. She really can only take it from the dead brother's property. And it has to be written, and this is the reason why. And with this very interesting thing, if they don't specify what land, what will happen? What did I tell you? That when they first write this adrachta, they seize property already. They kind of designate it. They don't seize it, but they designate property. And then it's already kind of with her name on it. But there's 30 days of announcing. First they evaluate, then they announce. In all that time, if she knows it's going to be hers, what does she do? She invests in it. So they take any property of his, because Rabbi Shila didn't distinguish. Let's say they take his own property. She starts investing in it because she knows it's going to be hers, even though it's not hers yet, right? She starts investing in it. And then right? Because they're going to sell it, but she wants it sold for a higher price. Now he knows that it's going to come from, in the end, from the dead brother's property. So he starts ignoring the dead brother's property because he knows that she's going to get that in the end, and he doesn't care. So he lets it, he basically ignores it. And then the date comes, and he says, oh, by the way, this is the one you could sell, not that one. And she ends up investing in this property that ends up going to him, and she ends up with the lower property. Now, what's the problem with this? You think the problem is that she gets cheated out, but the real problem is much more serious than that. It's not that we're only worried. We are worried about this woman, but what's going to happen? People are going to bet all in arms about what this man did. But in the end, it's really not he's the one at fault. It's the courts that are at fault that they didn't write it in the document. The court made the mistake. And then people are going to say, what a terrible court system we have. And this goes back to all the sugiyot we've been learning. And we saw before today also about it. And we don't want people to say, oh, look what havoc the courts can wreak because they make all these mistakes. And therefore, now in the end, this woman got messed up because of what the courts did, which is ironic. But the whole halacha was instituted that they had to write this phrase in it so that it didn't cause more broader problems. So with this, Hadron halacha noseh, and yes, as you say, I have a fascinating story. My love of this story is obviously the smart, bright woman who knows halacha, tries to get what she wants. Unfortunately, she doesn't win, but she does put in a really good effort, and she's very assertive and wants to get what she's deserving of. And I thought it was very interesting as we started our daf with this very assertive woman of the Amav, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who's also a very well-respected figure in the Gemara. And all the time, by the way, not just in our story, she's always outwitting the rabbis. She clearly always knows more than them, right? And she basically, in certain areas anyway, and she's the one who ends up being the respected one in the story who made things happen in the way that they were supposed to happen. So with that, we will end our daf. Nice way to kind of get toward the end of Masechet Ketubot. Number one, I can't remember if I said this or not, but the other thing I wanted to talk about, can't remember now because I taught the Hebrew before, but the other thing about the death of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, I didn't talk about this, is that you see we've been talking all along about Ketubot and Yevamot and all these women who are in these situations, many of them because their husbands died, if we take all of Yevamot and part of Ketubot, right, where it's either she's divorced or she's a widow. Many times we're discussing the widow. And I think also they're trying to get to hear the human part of the whole story about the death and the loss and the woman, right? Because how we get to the story of Rebbi, because we were talking about his widow who was trying to get food from the orphans. And I think they're trying to also remind us that there's a death going on here, and there's also mourning that's involved in this death process that we kind of ignore often in our telling of the story. So that's another element of today's daf. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a great day. As they say in Hebrew, Choref Tov, and we'll meet up tomorrow.